all the recognition. She was chosen as one of the 100 best and brightest leaders by Irish American Magazine. So Eileen will be interviewed today by Gregg Sommer, partner and North American director of the Mercer Sentinel Group. So please welcome Eileen and Gregg to the stage.
So, good morning, Eileen. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for being open to discuss the Bridgewater culture and how important it is to investment success. The Bridgewater culture is often noted as a key contributor towards its success. So I think it's critical. Everyone always focuses on the investment side, but it's critical to understand the culture that produces those types of results.
Right.
The group that I lead has reviewed thousands of investment organizations, including Bridgewater. And I must say, it is not replicated very often in other organizations. It is a quite unique culture. So why don't we start with you talking about a couple concepts that you use very often, radical truth and radical transparency, and what they are, how they're applied, and why they're so fundamental at Bridgewater.
Okay, great. So firstly, it's all tied to our mission, Gregg, wherein, we aspire to be the best investment firm in the world. And that's driven by people and processes and technologies that, produce unique understanding of markets, as well as deep insights for the purpose of providing, high-quality return streams for our clients. In order to do that, we believe that the center of all that is radical truth and radical transparency. And what I mean by that is really radical truth and radical transparency. First time I went up to Bridgewater, I didn't really know what the meaning of it was. And I was pretty confused by it. I was invited by Ray to a meeting that had about 30 people in it. And the head of operations was there, and he was being what we call probed by 30 people as to an error that took place. And I sat there for about 10 minutes and thought, how do I get out of this place as quickly as possible? And I told Ray at the end of this, the person was being asked, did you demonstrate common sense? Did you demonstrate judgment? Not just the error itself, not the outcome. And so what I told Ray was, listen, I don't think this place is for me, but I said I'd help you with this particular project, so I'll do it. And then after 6 months, I realized that it was terrific. And what I mean by that is there's a social contract between all of us at Bridgewater to be radically truthful with each other for the purpose of improving ourselves as people and for, basically the business, not putting people in positions where they're not good at them. So, it's not the truth, it's a truth in any situation, and then we look for patterns. And we believe without that, without focusing on outcomes that weren't satisfactory, and without focusing on what it tells us about our people, we wouldn't be successful. So we do this for the purpose of constantly improving how we go about things. But it's not for everybody. You have to be pretty comfortable.
So I think of trying to apply that in society or to other organizations. How do you create that environment, or how do you make people feel comfortable and trust in that environment so that they can excel? How does that actually work in practice?
It takes time, particularly for senior hires that come into Bridgewater, and we've hired a lot of senior people, and people who tend to, we have a high attrition rate initially, which we know we will have, and we pay the price for that. Because we feel that the culture is so important. But after about 18 months, people get used to it. I get a kick out of new hires, particularly senior hires, where they come in and say, wow, I cannot wait to participate in radical truth and radical transparency. I have been looking for this for my entire life. And they're very excited and passionate about it until the truth and transparency is about them. And then they're not so enthusiastic about it anymore. So to make it happen, you have to be comfortable with it. And it goes from the most junior person to the most senior person. So we have this process where people issue log any bad outcome. Those issue logs are, basically we have service level agreements on the severity ones, 4s and 5s. They're diagnosed on a weekly basis, down to the individual. And anybody ranging from Ray, me, David, can be issue logged on any particular topic. And people see through the behaviors of senior management on a day-to-day basis, that they can trust that, we're doing this to make them better. And so then I think they feel more comfortable opening themselves up. Some people may call it becoming more vulnerable. I see it as becoming stronger to be able to face, your weaknesses. And so people see it through the, constant daily routine of how we go through this.
So with these issue logs, or with this approach, how are people improving upon themselves? How are you maximizing certain people's strengths, minimizing weaknesses? As a team, how does that work in practice?
So the way it works in practice is that we have what's called baseball cards, just like a baseball player would have a baseball card, that has attributes on it that, there's probably 87 of them, 90, that range from values to capabilities to skills. And on a daily basis, in every meeting, we have what's called a dot system, and we dot each other on how people are exhibiting those attributes in a meeting. And so, the dots then are reconciled to the baseball cards. So take me, for example. I score very low on organized. And so you probably wouldn't pick me to organize a meeting and make sure everybody got there on time. I score very high on creativity. And so when we put teams together, we look at what is the goal, what attributes do we think we require to achieve the goal, and let's look at the baseball cards and see who has those and how do they complement each other. And so what it also takes is, sitting back and saying, hey, I'm not really good at this, even though I might be the person accountable for the outcome. This person's much better at organizing, basic projects or something. And so I'm going to take a back seat and let them lead. And so it's just this constant, kind of humility that you're not good at everything. It's okay. You have weaknesses. Some are capabilities. I don't, at this point in my career, I'm not going to try and become the organized, get the stars on organization. On the other side of the coin, knowing that, I don't put myself in that position. And so that's how the teams operate.
So as opposed to, instead of trying to potentially improve weaknesses or things that may be innate in people, you're kind of complementing each other with strengths? Or
Yeah, we're complementing each other, and we're trying to, through time. So someone who's just starting out in their career, it may not be a capability gap, it may be a skill. So we'll provide people with training, see how they get on with it, et cetera. So, and it's not static. But, I'm just speaking for myself. I mean, after 35 years of working, there are certain things that I know I'm not good at. And I'm probably not going to try to get good at them. It's not innate in me. But we're constantly developing people and looking at these outcomes. And we'll adjust if we think we got it wrong. But if you take a pattern, the probability that you're more accurate than not is pretty high.
So is this a form of AI and machine learning?
It's definitely systematized. We systematize everything that we can, and there's judgment in it. But yeah, ultimately, I guess you could coin it that way.
Right,
and our founder, as part of his transition, Ray Dalio, he's been doing this for 40 years. All these articles now on culture and ethics that are taking a forefront again. He's been doing this for 40 years. And as part of his transition, we've all worked together to produce these things called baseball cards and dots as a part of, making sure the culture remains strong and alive. And as I said, it's not for everybody. You have to get comfortable with it. You can't constantly be in an environment where you're not comfortable.
So how about, I believe you also tape record conversations, and you have a process there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. All of our conversations are tape recorded. And the goal of it is if I miss a meeting, I can listen to the tape recording. And some of them are actually even videoed. And it also serves for if we have a difference of opinion, we can go back to the tape and see what went awry. I initially wasn't really crazy about it, and I'm not an avid tape listener. If it's a video, I'll watch it, but sitting listening to people talk for 2 hours is not something I'm particularly good at. But we use it mostly for training, and we use it for, hygiene in terms of what really happened. But that's pretty rare that we would use it in those instances.
So do you think, some people might think something like that would cause someone to have less trust, but do you think that actually promotes trust and a feeling of comfort?
It's interesting, Greg. Our taping is not a lawyer's dream, right? But on the other side of the coin, people trust that, no one's going to be talking behind their back. People don't have to worry about what is so-and-so thinking because they'll tell you. And so that stress of the politics associated with behind the back talking, or, people, coming up to people and telling them, I've seen this happen to people, they get fired and they didn't even see it coming. Like, that is not going to happen, that type of stress. And so there's tremendous trust, and we do surveys to see, are there issues with that? So to the extent people are being honest, which I believe they are, people really trust in it. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with it's at every level of the organization, and nobody's exempt from that.
So do you think it's a certain type of personality that can excel in this environment? Can it be learned? Does it have to do with upbringing? How does that work?
I don't know the answer to your question in terms of, giving you a body of evidence for it. What I can tell you is I come from a family of 9. I have 5 brothers, 3 sisters. And my 2 eldest brothers went to Vietnam. My 2 younger brothers protested against it, so you could get a sense of how people, had dialogues with each other. So I'm kind of used to that back and forth. And my younger sister has said things to me I won't repeat. And I just heard Kevin talk about family. I want to take his intro back to my family because I don't always get that kind of praise from them. But at the end of the day, I think if you are curious, if you are a learner, if you want to be self-aware about yourself, if you're comfortable being vulnerable and you're open-minded, you will absolutely love the place. If you detest politics and behind-the-scenes things, you will love it. But if you're someone that is not that way, you're probably not going to like it at all. And that doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you wouldn't be comfortable at Bridgewater. And we will not, for anybody, make an exception to our values.
So how quickly do you usually know whether somebody is going to prosper?
Usually within the first 18 months, and people will elect out. I mean, we've hired senior people that, they're like, this just isn't for me. Or having a junior person question what you're doing, that's not for me. And, some people say, geez, you guys spend so much time analyzing things. Isn't that a waste of time? I think it's a tremendous investment to make sure the culture is alive, but it ties back to the mission of constantly learning. And so initially, honestly, I thought it was a little bit overboard, but I'm a real believer now in spending the time on that. And even junior people. I remember when I first came to Bridgewater, I've been doing what I was doing for 30 years. Someone who was fresh out of school was like, I don't think you're doing this right, and let me tell you why. And I was like, what? My God, where are you coming from? And so taking the time to explain to people, do you really know what you're talking about? Do you see how you might want to do trade-offs in terms of you might want to speak your mind, but, think about how much time you're spending on that, et cetera. So it's a terrific developmental tool for making our professionals stronger and for them understanding what they're not strong at and complementing that with others who are. And so we have these 2 other notions with radical truth and radical transparency at the very center of everything we do. We talk a lot about meaningful work and meaningful relationships. And my true belief is that you have to have meaningful relationships with people, or I have to, in order for me to be comfortable with being vulnerable to radical truth. And, we have something like, and Ray used to, up until 5 years ago, Ray actually was responsible for this. He passed it on to me. We have 160 different groups. Of course, we have groups that are affinity groups like LGTB and so on and so forth, but we have 160 groups ranging from the book club to the soccer team, etc. And we believe it's really important to include, new employees, to include people that come in across the board and embrace them in terms of some of what their interests are. And, that's part of the meaningful relationships. It's also true that, Ray, for example, his personal doctor is available to us. When anyone has an illness, he helps us research things and so on and so forth. So it's really, we want people to join Bridgewater forever, and we want them to be part of the Bridgewater family, and I mean that sincerely. And I also understand that, it's not for everybody.
So let's talk about the relationship. So it sounds like a fairly intense type of environment, certainly people challenging each other, challenging ideas, constantly trying to improve. How do personal relationships form? Is it a community or family type of feel? How does integrity, ethics, giving back to the community? How does that all come into play?
So, in the pursuit of excellence, and again, I'm going to keep coming back to this radical truth, radical transparency. I don't mean to be a broken record, but that integrity is crucial, we believe, to accomplishing our mission. And it's kind of a family atmosphere. And I don't know about you, but for me, my family tells me things that, I may not want to hear, but they do it out of a sense of love and kindness to make me a better person. And so the radical truth, some people think it sounds harsh, it sounds stressful. I think it's very kind. And why I say that is that, look at the financial crisis. I mean, is it true that everybody in all those firms didn't know the risk that the firms were taking on board? And look at all the people that lost their jobs in the aftermath of that are never going to have those jobs again. Well, if there was radical truth and radical transparency, I suspect, it's a hypothesis, that a lot of that could have been avoided. And so I'm a really big believer in it. I see it as kindness. I don't see it as stressful. I also appreciate that some people do experience it as stressful. Some get over it as they embrace it and see that actually there's no problem with me having weaknesses. Everyone does. And some people kind of are like, this place just isn't for me. It's too stressful.
I can relate with my family. So growing up as well as my current family, it's a constant challenge. So everything down to technicalities to concepts. I think some people are comfortable with that and others may not be. So I can understand that.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's probably like everything. It's a combination of genetics with environment and what you're used to. I'm sure there's some combination there. But I think it would probably be hard for somebody who's never experienced that to walk in, and they'd have to truly try to really want to embrace it, or have some real motivation or aspiration to succeed, to overcome it. So how about things such as diversity? I mean, you're at the top of Bridgewater. That says a lot about Bridgewater in a topic that's very prevalent in the investment industry.
As I told you, I grew up in a housing project, and it was a very diverse place that I grew up in, with people from, Germany, people from Tanzania, people from Yugoslavia, all over the world, and different religions and so on and so forth. So I was really lucky to grow up in a very diverse area. Now, some of my siblings will tell me, well, we were poor. I never experienced poor, but that's another story. And so when I first started working, this notion of diversity, I knew about diversity of thought, arguing points back and forth. I really didn't get it. It took me a while to get it. And I'm not satisfied with where we are as a financial services industry. When I first started working in 1980, I'd like to say I was 12, but I wasn't. 0.5 of the professionals at senior levels were women in the financial services industry. Today it's 17%, 18%. It hovers around that. And I honestly don't know if I should, go out and do the happy dance or cry. But what I do know is that not just women, but people of color, LGBT, etc., I do know that we're not where we need to be, and I'm not satisfied where we are. And I also know, and I know this from personal experience, I tend to have people around me that think very differently. And I do that because I appreciate the challenge, and I genuinely believe that you come up with better solutions by getting that. But it's hard sometimes. It's a lot easier to have a conversation with someone that agrees with you. And so, on some days at the end of the day, I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? But on balance, and by and large, I just think you get better solutions and better answers. So I think it's good for business. I think that that's been demonstrated by many. I don't want to make the case for diversity any more than I would ask someone to make the case for homogeneity, other than to say, clearly, you get a better solution with diversity of thought, and that comes from different perspectives. So we will continue to work at that. And again, I'm not satisfied where we are as an industry, I think we have to keep going at it till we get to where, the population is represented in a way that makes sense. So if half the intellectual capital of the world happens to be women, then, it bodes for a lot higher than 17%.
Well, it sounds like an environment where many of the superficial or societal surface attributes are not critical. It's the idea, it's the performance, it's the challenge, it's pursuing excellence. So that would be consistent with fairness.
Yeah, our founder, Ray Dalio, is consumed with innovation. And it's not just in the investment engine, it's throughout all of Bridgewater. And, he spends a lot of time getting to know people, and he's put systems in place where we all get to know each other. And it's really a meritocracy. Now, you may get something wrong, but through time, given the amount of data that we collect on this, the probability that you're going to get it right is much higher.
So let's talk about the concept of meritocracy. Okay, it's not a democracy, it's not an autocracy. It's talk about that environment. We've talked about it's the same thing we've been talking about. We talked about it from the people perspective. But how do you get to the best idea? Is it a bunch of people thrown into a room, throwing out ideas, debating? How does that work in practice?
In practice, it starts with what's the problem? And why is it a problem against our mission? And then you basically can come up with your own idea. You can get people in a room, but you have to put the problem out there. And so it varies on the problem. I'll give you an example. When I first got to Bridgewater, after the financial crisis, after the Madoff situation, and looking at the operations, I'm not an operations person, I'm actually a financial person, and looking at the accounting, I was like, why are we in this business? Someone can do it better than us. And it took me about 2 months to come up with an idea. Why don't we have one firm clear and settle our transactions and have a dual processor on the other side? And I looked at the cost and I said, geez, if I take the total cost of ownership when I consider BCP, when I consider the regulatory environment at the time was, just humming, and when I look at the cost of new products and how to deal with them from those aspects, and I look at, geez, I have these great people. What kind of opportunities can I give them if I'm an investment firm versus if they were a firm where this was the core competency? And so we came up with this dual processor model. The total cost of ownership was actually cheaper. Our employees that went over love it. As a matter of fact, we did this transaction, I think it was 8 years ago, and 104 of the 114 people are still with the new firm and getting career opportunities. They're a global company, so it's great for our employees. Our clients love it. The inventory valuations are done, by 2 independent banks that are, significantly important financial institutions. And so it was great for our clients, great for our employees, and great for Bridgewater. In order to get that achieved, I said it maybe took 2 months to come up with the idea. I was subjected to consultants coming in saying, wow, this is a really bad idea. The banks that we dealt with initially saying it's a really bad idea. And, Ray was not convinced it was a bad idea. But he was convinced that he couldn't just let me do something so important like that. So he wanted what he would term other believable people to look at it. And so that process, I think, got us to a very different place than we would have gotten to if we just did traditionally what's done. And we got there by meritocracy and is this a good idea? It doesn't have to be done before. Is it a good idea? And let's keep kicking it until we see what the holes are. And so that whole process and framework is one that we follow at Bridgewater for approaching any problem.
So one of the concepts I've heard you talk about is people tend to repeat the same mistakes and not necessarily learn. And I know that's contrary to your beliefs. How that's something that all of us could learn to do better, to go back and say, okay, there's nothing wrong with mistakes, but how do we move on from there? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what we look for is patterns in the mistake. So, if you do the same thing 10 times, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We're probably not going to let you, that attribute of yours, if it's required to be successful in a goal or something, you're not going to be the lead in that until you demonstrate that that's not the case. And so people just accept it. They just accepted that, think about this, Greg, we have every single meeting you're in, people dotting you on these attributes. So, I think I have something like, 40,000 dots for last year or something. And then when you start looking at the patterns in them, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of instances, so the likelihood that it's accurate is pretty high. And if you're open-minded, that it's not a big deal if you're not good at something, and someone else can do it, it all works. But if you think that we're going to keep putting you in the position of doing something that doesn't make sense, this isn't the place for you.
Got it. So and
many people will say, oh, I can't do that. That's not my strength. We need someone else. I mean, people really know their baseball cards.
So do you have people that make the same mistake over and over again and say, hey, this is not working? Or is that one of the identifying factors? Or that's just, it doesn't get to that point?
It typically doesn't get to that point unless it's on values. So we've hired senior people that didn't share the values, and we've had conversations that, look, this just doesn't work. No, it's not okay to talk about someone behind their back. It's not okay. And I don't care what kind of producer you are or how good you are at what you do, you just don't belong here because we will not tolerate a pollution of the culture.
Do people burn out? It sounds like an environment of possible burnout.
You know, I think people burn out as much at Bridgewater as they do in other companies I've been at. And, you know, we really stress work-life balance. And you know this. I mean, you take a vacation, you come back, you're rejuvenated, you're re-energized, you're more creative. So we really do encourage that. But yeah, sure, we have some people who burn out. But I don't think it's because of the culture. Because if you actually believe in the culture and you believe in radical truth, it's energizing. Like, I don't have to sit there and worry, like, what does so-and-so think? I mean, it doesn't even cross my mind anymore.
Right. So how do you, I know you've talked about some of these controls and methods in place. I know it's a very structured environment, but what happens if you make multiple bad hires or there's a trend or direction going away from your core? How do you make sure you don't go to the wrong place from a cultural perspective?
Well, we, as I told you, we have this dot system, so everybody's being dotted. We have these baseball cards. It's a constant, you know, it's a huge data collection process. So it's really hard to, you know, escape below the line of not being good at something and not being noticed. What we do, though, is we give people tests, meaning let me put you in this particular position, let's see how you do, maybe you should be with a different manager. But at the end of the day, if nothing's working out, it's probably better for you and probably better for us if you move on. But that's more rare. It's more about people, you know, not being comfortable in the culture. And so that's more often than not the case.
What has surprised you the most since you've been at Bridgewater, and what do you think the most common misunderstandings of Bridgewater are?
You know, I think the most common misunderstandings, like some of the titles we have for things or some of the analogies that are used in the principles, like the wildebeest and the hyena, is a pretty dramatic way to describe things. But if alternatively we said, listen, we're trying to make people better, stronger athletes for their particular roles, that sounds like a good thing to do. And so I think that we are misunderstood in that way in terms of, you know, what's out in the press. And, you know, sometimes when people leave, like any firm, they're not complimentary. I've also heard people, you know, ask me, my God, you work for that crazy place, Bridgewater. And I don't think it's crazy. And I've been in this industry for 35 years. I really honestly believe that if you operate in this framework in this way, that it's really great for the business and it's great for the people. So I think that's one misunderstanding, and I can tell you, Greg, I misunderstood it initially. I was like, what are these guys and gals doing with this probing session and wasting all this time trying to understand this mistake at, you know, levels of, was it common sense, was it judgment, was it this, was it that? But you could imagine if you do that through time, how well people know themselves and each other, which will produce better outcomes. So
why do you think that it's so difficult, or why haven't more firms replicated Bridgewater's culture? Is it, I know Bridgewater's had tremendous success. Normally that creates a domino effect. Thoughts on that?
I first started out in public accounting and then went to Morgan Stanley when it was a private company. And Bridgewater reminds me of Morgan Stanley before it was public in terms of apprenticeship, partnership, people really looking at why was this a bad outcome, because different words, but really with an intent to make each other better. And so I don't know the answer to the question because it makes so much sense to me, but I do know that people are uncomfortable. There are people who are just uncomfortable with facing their weaknesses. There are people uncomfortable with, yeah, I made a mistake. And if you're that kind of person, I'm not saying you're a bad person, this isn't the place for you. But I think I think if more businesses adapted it, like I talked about the financial crisis, if everybody in the financial firm said, hey, I think we have too much exposure to this particular marketplace in this particular way, and it really went up to the top, I think we would have had a different outcome.
Okay. Another term I've heard referred to Bridgewater, or that has been shared by leadership, is pain plus reflection equals progress. Obviously, that's consistent with what we're talking about, but does that...
Well, I also like to think pleasure plus reflection equals progress, but that's another story. That's another, the word pain has this pejorative negativity associated with it. What it is putting yourself in the position to really look at yourself and become self-aware. And self-awareness, and at least I'll speak for myself, I've learned more from my mistakes and failures than I've learned from my successes. And focusing on what went wrong there, how did I play my role, that's really what the pain is about. And some people are pained that, hey, wow, I contributed in a big way to this particular mistake. So that's basically what the thought of that is. And if you can own your weaknesses and you can let others guardrail you or compliment you, and if you reflect on how to do that, you will make a lot more progress, I believe.
So how about the two integral parts of any organization would be the culture and the people. How do you want people to excel in your culture, but how do you separate them? So if you took the Bridgewater culture out and had the same people, or if you took the people out and had the same culture, how do you think about that conceptually?
I think that I don't separate them. I think you have to have in your essence a desire to pursue truth, a desire to learn and be curious, a desire to get the best outcome, even if it's not you producing it. And I think you have to be open-minded and have a lot of humility. I mean, it's not always fun to face your weaknesses, particularly if you thought you were good at it, And so it's just that who the people are. Can they embrace that, and can they adopt to it? I mean, they've done studies on why senior people at other firms don't work out. That was a high attrition rate there too. And what worked in one firm may not work at another. And so it has to be part of your DNA in order for you to be successful. The culture has to be part of your DNA. It has to be how you behave on a day-to-day basis. It has to be you acting in a way whether I'm watching you or not. And if it's not, it's not authentic. It'll probably produce a lot of stress. You'll probably figure out it's not the place for you, and you'll probably move on.
So are these concepts, is this culture the secret sauce? I mean, is that what allows Bridgewater to perform at such a high level?
I wouldn't presume to say the secret sauce for everybody else, but what I would say is it's the secret sauce for Bridgewater's investment performance and how we handle our clients. So it's our secret sauce.
So when you approach from an investment perspective, when you approach serving clients, when you approach all the supporting functions, this is consistent across all functions of Bridgewater, and there are no exceptions?
There is absolutely no exceptions.
Okay. And is there any particular example of where this might have resulted in a wrong decision or a great learning experience with Bridgewater, and any examples that you might bring up?
Sure. I think that, I'll use the cash settlements area. You have a loss due to someone making an error. And that's evaluated. You evaluate the person, and you find out that the person doesn't really like, through time, to deal with numbers or detail or be very linear. But they're a great lateral thinker. You might move them out of there. And in the case I'm talking about, we did move the person out of there. And they moved into another area that needed to be strategically looked at and handled differently, and they excelled.
That's great. Okay, I think we're going to open it up for some questions. Is there a mic out there? I think someone's coming over.
There was a report recently about how Bridgewater